Hey there, guys. All right, today we are back with some more history matters, and this time, why wasn't there a Turkish missile crisis? A short animated documentary. Um, Before we dive in, make sure you go and check out the links in the description box below. I'd love it if you joined the Discord and followed me over at Twitch. Okay, really got nothing. Why wasn't there a Turkish missile crisis? I feel like this perhaps is a little wrong to say. I feel like there was. It was instead the focus was I think a lot of it actually kind of has to do with the fact that if we look at it and define like a victor of the Cold War, right, whose government still exists, the United States won the Cold War. If it had been the other way around, and let's say the capitalist world fell, and the USSR survived to the modern day, I feel like we would actually be calling it the Turkish missile crisis instead of the Cuban missile crisis. And my reasoning for that is because I'm fairly certain that the Russian response to there being missiles in Turkey was to put missiles in Cuba. If I'm remembering the timeline of events here, that's how it was. Missiles got put in Turkey. Russia responded by putting missiles in Cuba. And then of course, the United States really blew up over the whole missiles being in Cuba part. And then JFK like quietly spoke to the leader of the Soviet Union. He was like, "Hey, I'll pull the missiles out of Turkey if you get rid of the missiles in Cuba." And that was that. So really, if we want to be like semantic about things, could really like if I'm correct in the details there, um, the Cuban Missile Crisis is the Turkish Missile Crisis. Like they're the same thing, really. If anything, it would probably be more accurate to call it the Turkish Missile Crisis, because really, like those missiles should not have gone to Turkey. They should not have been put in Turkey. Now, of course, in terms of like, yeah, but defense, like yes, but also if we look at the political climate of the time period, putting missiles in Turkey is very much an extremely aggressive move, and therefore it should not have been done unless you want to end the world. So, no one try and argue that the US was in the right to put missiles in Turkey. They weren't. No. And of course, right, Russia was not in the right to put missiles in Cuba, but I'm giving them some leeway here purely because it was as a response to the United States putting missiles on their fucking back door, right? In their neighbor. As long as I'm remembering the timeline of events here, for this. So, uh, yeah, let's dive in.
One of the most famous events in the Cold War was the Cuban Missile Crisis, in which a crisis occurred in Cuba concerning missiles. This
I fucking love you, History Matters.
saw the Soviet Union place nuclear weapons in Allied Cuba. As you may know, the USSR stationed weapons in Cuba in response to the United States earlier placing its own nuclear weapons in Italy and Turkey. The
Okay, yes, I was right.
Soviets knew about the weapons in Turkey, they were furious, but ultimately they didn't make a fuss about it like the Americans did with Cuba. Which raises the question, why? Why wasn't there a Turkish
Okay, but here's the well, them putting missiles in Cuba is kind of raising a fuss over it, and perhaps now, of course, I don't like y'all know I don't really read any. I don't do research on 20th century things. I just go off of what I've learned from these videos and from what I've heard in real life, and growing up and things like that. Um, there's perhaps an argument to be made that the Russian leader knew exactly how America would respond to them putting missiles in Cuba. So perhaps that was their way of being like, this is how the Americans are going to listen to our complaints and do what we want. And if that's the case, that's pretty clever, right? That's not the case, and they were just doing it as a like, fuck you, you doing this to us, I'm gonna do it to you, right? Which that'd be the petty way to go. and not the necessarily politically thought out way to go, but also, putting the missiles in Cuba in the first place, no matter the circumstance, could also be the not politically thought out way to go. This is a rabbit hole of semantics and interpretation here.
Turkish missile crisis after America stationed nukes there. So, as of 1960, things between the United States and the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics were getting a bit tense.
No
and
way.
one of the things that the US government had to concern itself with was nuclear war. And a part of potentially winning said war was reducing the amount of warning that the USSR would get when the missiles were launched. And at the time, there were two main ways of doing this. One, develop faster missiles, which sounded hard, or two, move the missiles closer. The second option was chosen when President Eisenhower offered to store them in Turkey and Italy. This was to reassure them that America would be there and to deter the USSR from using nuclear weapons against them. The USSR learned of these potential deployments in about 6 seconds, and Premier Nikita Khrushchev routinely complained to the US, Italian and Turkish governments about their deployment. In 1961, when brand new, not shot President John F. Kennedy was sworn in, it was his hope
Not shot Kennedy.
to find a long-term mutual agreement to some of the issues of the day. As such, he and Khrushchev met in Vienna to discuss what could be done. This meeting went poorly. Khrushchev berated the new president, calling him a weak leader whose actions across the world were overtly and covertly hostile towards his government and its communist allies. Kennedy had been toying with the idea of removing the missiles from Turkey, but when Khrushchev issued the Americans an ultimatum to leave Berlin or face war, he opted to keep them. And just over a year later, Soviet nukes were on their way to Cuba. So why didn't the Soviet Union publicly demand the removal of nuclear weapons?
Remove your nukes. Nikki demands denuclearization of Turkey. Pravda. It means truth. June 16th, 1961. 10 Soviet monies. Remove weapons or face nuclear war, says Premier. Our Premier Nikita Khrushchev has demanded that the United States remove nuclear weapons from Turkey or we'll just all have to die in a fireball. After it came to light that the U.S. had decided to place Jupiter missiles on our borders, the Presidium made it public its findings and has demanded that the weapons return to America or Turkey will be invaded, saying, "We recognize that this will probably lead to everyone dying horribly in nuclear fire, but we can hide in the Urals, so we'll be fine." Stalin probably wasn't the nicest man in the world, says former colleagues. Pravda has received exclusive interviews with former colleagues of Comrade Stalin, many of whom have independently said that he may have been quite mean at times, and sometimes liked to have people shot if they were mildly inconvenient. The revelations risk associating the name Stalin with negative emotions instead of the happy dad-like figure we've all come to know and love. However, not all were so critical. One former colleague who spent 6 years in an all-expenses-paid happy camp spoke of how he misses Stalin so much he'll be looking over his shoulders for him for the rest of his life, in case he comes back. Very touching. Do we all have too much food? No, say Soviet residents. Members of the Politburo have launched a survey across the USSR to ask its residents if they are receiving too much food. The response was an overwhelming no, with some traders even claiming that they didn't get enough food and wanted more. The survey was launched after 2 members of the Politburo were told by their wives that they were oppressively fat for communists. The 2 Politburo members then formally requested the survey to prove that it wasn't their fault, but that everyone was just getting too much food.
Weapons from Turkey in 1961 like the USA would do with Cuba the next year? Well, there were 2 main reasons. The first reason that the United States could publicly demand that the USSR cease their nuclear activities in Cuba was that they thought that they could stop it. JFK's advisors didn't think that nuclear weapons were actually on the island yet. Spoiler alert, they were, but at the time the Americans didn't know for sure. And thus it was believed that the USA's much mightier navy could stop the USSR from ever delivering them. Furthermore, the United States believed that in the event of a war, the US could quickly overwhelm Cuba with an invasion before the USSR could really react. Whereas the USSR had no such beliefs. In order to remove the weapons from Turkey, the Soviets would have needed to launch a major land invasion. This would have dragged the rest of NATO into a war, thereby threatening the existence of communism in Eastern Europe, and also such a military build-up would have been spotted long in advance. And reason number 2 that the USSR said nothing was, well, what was new? The USA already had long-range missiles pointed at Moscow, and since the 1950s it had fleets of long-range bombers posted in numerous NATO countries which were more than capable of launching nuclear attacks against the USSR. The Soviet government was, frankly, used to having American nuclear weapons at high readiness pointed at them, and making their existence publicly known would do nothing but panic the Soviet people. As such, Khrushchev kept quiet and used the Cuban crisis to get the missiles removed from Turkey and a guarantee of Cuba's security.
Okay, so it's essentially as I was saying. He put the missiles there to get the USA to back off a little.
Which frankly meant that after the crisis, the USSR had more in 1962 than it did in 1960. I hope you enjoyed this episode.
Yeah. Shit. Did I do a good job? Kind of talking, making my prediction or whatever at the beginning of the video? That rarely happens. because usually I watch things that I'm learning about that I don't really have too much information on beforehand, because just continuously watching stuff that I already know kind of is a little boring. But that was why there wasn't a Turkish missile crisis, though technically there was. A short animated documentary by History Matters. I hope you guys enjoyed. Remember to hit that like button and subscribe for more, and I will see you guys in the next video. Peace.